Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-63 will legalize cannabis within the limits that my colleagues have talked about. Many decisions are up to the provinces, including the age of legal use, the system of outlets, and awareness raising. The government is pushing for a very tight deadline. We're talking about adopting this bill by July 1st, 2018, which is in only 8 months. And we know that in politics, 8 months goes by very quickly. We're still waiting to see what the measures the federal government is going to put in place to ensure that this bill is enforced all across the country. And despite that, it seems to me clear that this is a bill that should go forward. The support for legalization of cannabis, but it needs to be done effectively, and it must not be sold to children. And people need to be aware of long-term effects on health, and it needs to be accompanied by prevention and an awareness-raising campaign. The criminalization of cannabis and its ban, as advocated by the Conservatives, was a very bad and ineffective strategy to reduce the consumption of cannabis and illegal activities related thereto across the country. And I talked about this earlier, but if we talk about the statistics, because I want people to take my word for this, there were statistics that were published on offenses, drug-related offenses, published by the police in 2014 after the Conservatives had put in place a very backward-looking system where the mandatory minimum sentences had been put in place to manage drug consumption. So 1 year later, there was the adoption of the repressive statutes by the Conservatives mean that the traffic of heroin had gone up by some 72%. Consumption had not been reduced, on the contrary, and drug trafficking had increased as well. So we have to ask, what strategy do we need to adopt to ensure that those who consume the most cannabis, that is people aged under 25, well, that segment of the population needs to be taken into account, and we need to stop burying our heads in the sand and saying, well, listen, this war on drugs has not worked, so what should the solution be? So the solution that the Liberals are proposing, which is to take a public health approach, is also something that we advocate, but there are many flaws in the Liberals' bill. Hence the importance of having a discussion. And unfortunately, we're at the report stage of third reading of this bill, the last reading of this bill, I should say, and we're concerned, we in the NDP are concerned because we moved a number of amendments where were completely dismissed out of hand by the Liberals in committee. So let's talk about the task force report. Experts explained that we needed to reduce the burden on the police and the justice system with regard to drug-related offences. Canadians must be prevented by entering the criminal system and having a criminal record because of simple possession. And third, protecting the health and public safety by strengthening laws regarding to more serious cannabis-related offences. This bill legalizes cannabis up to 4 plants per home, but the enforcement date of the bill, that is July 1st, 2018, is too early. And over the past 2 years, 100,000 people have had a criminal record for simple possession, whereas the government wants to legalize it in less than a year. So how many other young people is the government prepared to put in prison for something that is going to be legal in about 10 months? Will they at least send a message to legal authorities and police officers to not apply this law until such time as the new law comes into place? The Liberals, within their own working committee, received the recommendation to decriminalize cannabis, but they're not listening to us. The Prime Minister said not long ago that rehabilitation was going to fix judicial problems and clear up delays, because we know that a number of investigations that were not pursued for cases that were much more serious than simple possession of marijuana. And we're still undergoing this with C-45, where they don't want to decriminalize now, but this contributes to the court delays that we're seeing, and it means that there are astronomical expenses regarded to people who are being convicted for simple possession. StatsCan and other organizations have shown us over and over that these criminal records affect young people disproportionately, people from racial backgrounds and Indigenous people. So how many of these criminals, how many people have been arrested for smoking a joint? How many pardons are we talking about? Because as elected officials, and the government, the Liberal government as well, need to keep their promises, but they need to make fair choices for Canadians regardless of their age, the color of their skin, and so they should decriminalize cannabis temporarily. I don't understand why this is a problem, because this was part of the Liberal Party's platform in 2015. These changes to the bill have taken too long, and yet they will not come into effect for 15 months. There's a crisis in the court system, and police resources and legal resources must not be devoted to convicting people for simple possession of marijuana. It's a substance that is about to be legalized in a few months. The task force continued with regard to prevention and education, saying this bill must protect young Canadians by keeping cannabis away from young people and ensuring that Canadians are clearly informed through a public health campaign. And with regard to young people in particular, they must understand the risks of consuming cannabis. C-45 imposes heavy penalties for anyone trafficking or selling cannabis to underage people. And yet, I don't understand where the public health aspect comes in. First, we need more scientific research on the effects, long-term effects of consuming cannabis, but also we need to know what the properties of the plants are. Some people already use cannabis medically. We're talking about people who use it for therapy, veterans, for example. Liberals say they want to protect young people, but so are they going to increase funding for research that is linked to chronic and long-term consumption and the effects of this on young people? I'm also looking at the 2017 budget, which announced a ridiculous amount, less than $2 million over 5 years for this public health education. We saw last year where the budget was being upped some $6 million over 5 years. And still, once again, that's a completely absurd amount. Awareness raising needs not only federal resources, but also funding programs for community organizations who are on the front lines. These last organizations, such as schools, try to inform young people, and they are on the ground and they are ready to step in. But how can $6 million help, a paltry $6 million, help the millions of community organizations that we have in Canada? Will this burden once again fall on the provinces? That is a question that we are wondering. If I compare us with Colorado, we simply are not doing what needs to be done. Colorado spends some $37 million per year on awareness raising and prevention alone. So 7 times more than what the Canadian government intends to do for this major bill that it is introducing, and that it wants to come into force in less than 8 months, might I remind you.
We also don't know what the government will do with the money that it's going to collect from the sales of marijuana. What kinds of preventive programs will it put in place? And will there be funding for community groups? That is extremely important. And as I was saying, the bill raises many questions for the provinces. For example, will they need extra time to be able to adjust their regulatory frameworks? That's why we would have liked for the process to begin earlier, or that it be extended beyond the 1st of July. So there are issues related to the sales, the legal framework for legalizing marijuana in order to minimize risk. There's another issue that has to be clarified. What will be the fiscal structure? How will taxes be shared between the federal government and the provinces? And Canadians expect the Minister of Finance to tell them that. The minister in Quebec has already told them how dissatisfied he is with the fiscal framework. There is a lot more I would like to say. I see my time is running out. What I'd like to say is that the NDP brought forward 38 amendments in committee, and the 38 were turned down. That's absurd. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin actually with a point of clarification for the member. I thank her for her conditional support for Bill C-45. I'd want to just simply advise her that the government has in fact announced $46 million for a public education program that will begin to roll out very, very shortly. And I hope that addresses one of her concerns. But, Mr. Speaker, I seek clarification from her. The member stated that she supported decriminalization. But let's be really clear what decriminalization is. Decriminalization maintains the prohibition and simply replaces the criminal sanction with a civil penalty, a ticketing scheme with a fine. And so in an environment where the prohibition remains, one cannot regulate this substance. But when the member described her vision of decriminalization, she only said that the law would not be enforced. Not that it would be enforced in a different way with a different outcome, the civil penalty, but it would not be enforced. And I might submit, Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite that what she was describing is in fact legalization without regulation.
The
Honourable Member for Salaberry-Sur-Roi. Once again, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are showing how out of touch they are with the NDP's recommendations. My colleague announced $45 million, but that's over 5 years. That's about $9 million. And that's supposed to include all drugs, not just for the legalization of marijuana. Now, in terms of his second argument about decriminalization, what we are calling for is that while we wait for this legalization to take place, while we wait, given that these activities are going to be legalized, why would the government not immediately decriminalize while we wait for the legalization? So we're not saying one is opposed to the other. We're saying, why would we be imposing on thousands of young people throughout the country a criminal record that will prevent them from working, from buying a house, from traveling? Because that really does prevent a young person from doing many things. And I'm talking about simple possession. We're not talking about more serious offenses. So that's the subtle difference. And I think my colleague opposite will understand what I'm trying to say. We're also saying more investment should be made in prevention. The community groups have been asking for this for years. They're lacking this in schools. I don't know if he's gone into schools, but I'm a former teacher. And there are many young people who have been under the effect of drugs, including marijuana.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. She made many good points. It's clear that the government's not going to achieve their stated objectives with C-45. It's certainly not going to offload the criminal justice system because there's more criminality in this bill than there was already. It's certainly not going to keep cannabis out of the hands of children because they're allowing home grow, and it's certainly not going to get rid of organized crime. And I think if you want to implement something, you tend to look at who else did this and who else did it, with positive results. And if you look at Washington State, they were the ones who came and actually reduced organized crime to less than 20%, and young children there are finding it hard to get a hold of marijuana. And what did they do? Well, they didn't allow home grow, except for the medically fragile, and they controlled all of the distribution. They took their medical marijuana system that was very well regulated and expanded that out. And so it seems to me that this bill falls really short in so many areas, but especially in the area of public awareness. There were clear testimonies saying we needed to get on that, and we only have 234 days left before the government's arbitrarily ruling things out. Could the member comment on the public education that's needed?
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-Sur-Roi. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, in fact, as my colleague just said, there is not enough investment in prevention and in public awareness and education so that young people fully understand that we're not simply trivializing marijuana, that that's not what this is about. So we have to be working on the effects, and we have to invest in research into use, the effects of long-term use on the health of young people. So the Liberals have to invest more money into that area. And I can never say it enough. Prevention is so important. My colleague has spoken about that as well. Now, on the other hand, we have to stop criminalizing. We have to stop increasing the criminal burden on young people for simple possession. It has been shown in several studies that the war on drugs did not work. The use of drugs continued to increase. Drug trafficking continued to increase over the past 10 years. So we really need to change our strategy.
Please do debate.
Resuming debate.
Markham.